Now, my next guest is a fantastic writer and academic, and he's written about the impact of harsh climate change policies and ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance principles. Ralph Schoellhammer, thank you so much for joining me. I want to start with the self-inflicted energy crisis across much of Europe and in particular in Germany. This is particularly relevant for Australia because we are now turbocharging the very same policies that are causing real hardship in Europe. How severe is Germany's energy crisis, and how do you think they're going to cope in the coming winter?
Well, hi, Rita. Thank you so much for having me. I think your assessment is absolutely spot on. We're only seeing now gradually unfolding what we can be afraid of the coming winter, particularly with the sabotage acts against Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Any hope is now gone that there will be some deal with Russia one way or another to keep the gas flows going in the same dimension as they have in the past. And basically, now the dirty secret is out in the open. The energy transition of Europe was built on cheap fossil fuels from countries and areas outside of Europe, primarily Russia. So this was something that was sold to the people. Oh, we go green, we go wind, we go solar. When in fact, we did that, but by the same token, outsourced our energy to other countries. And the people have been, and that's a strong word, I know, the people have been lied to, and now we gradually get the bill for the mistakes of the past. And the worrisome thing is, one could have said, all right, we tried this and now we switch back to reality. But we have been so wedded to the ideological idea, the ideological content of the energy transition, of net zero and all these other things that come with it, that we are unwilling to go back to what would be the only solution, which is produce energy on our own, whether it's nuclear, whether it's natural gas, and all these other opportunities that would be there. So I'm worried that these things will get worse before they get better, because what you see a lot in the media, everybody talks about the winter, but we also need energy in the summer, right? It's true that the heating problem is less in the summer, but we still need energy for the industry. So you can say, well, look at this, we survived the winter, which, by the way, is a very low bar for the supposedly richest area in the world. But even if we survive winter, which I'm sure we do, it's going to be an industrial wasteland. So that is not a particularly encouraging outlook for the future.
No, I mean, the winter, of course, industry is going to need energy throughout the year, but you really do fear about the people's lives being unnecessarily lost because they can't afford to heat their homes during a bad winter. And you've noted, Ralph, that losing two world wars didn't stop the re-emergence of Germany as an industrial power, but few decades of green ideology may do just that.
Yeah, it seems to be one of the continuous characteristics of Germany that suicide in the name of an ideology really seems to be ingrained into German history. But the problem I see is it has spread. The philosopher Leo Strauss once said, there can be a situation in which a country uses the military conflict but wins the ideological conflict. And it sometimes seems as that is true with Germany. Pretty much the entire West has signed up to this, green boondoggle program that did originate in Germany. And again, I'm sure a lot of this was well-intended. I'm sure a lot of this was driven by sincere and honest ideas and beliefs that the world is on the brink of collapsing. But now we see that the path and the ideas that green movements and smaller, even more radical movements have proposed is not working. And I think this is bleeding through in other areas as well. The danger of being so imbued and stubborn in one's ideology, of course, has problems that go beyond the energy sector, right? I mean, this is a larger program. I think something that the left has realized more than the right. Just think about it. Think about how many environmental movements talk about we need to abandon capitalism. We need to abandon the entire system. So they realize that this is broader than just the environment for them in ideological terms. While we on the right, if I'm allowed to say we, or those, let's say, who are further on the right, still think we're talking about the particulars of one sector, like, oh, this is only about energy. No, this is a conflict of ideologies, right? A conflict of, you can call it a cultural conflict, of completely different worldviews that, if you allow me this one last sentence, that bleeds in other areas. Take another example. Why is it so hard for Europeans or the West in general to support the women in Iran? Well, because for decades we have told ourselves that the biggest problem is Islamophobia. So now that apparently the women of Iran are standing up, for example, against forced veiling, against forced headscarves, it really puts us into an awkward position, because it turns out that even the people living in mostly Islamic countries are not particularly fond of radical Islam, that we in the West told ourselves is only existing in the imagination of the Islamophobes. You saw it in something you played before, right? The new Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, and her reaction to Emmanuel Macron. She's absolutely right, right? The biggest problem for Africa is not climate change. It's climate policies driven by the West that deny them access to energy. Give Africa energy, and people most likely have no longer a reason to leave. And again, this bleeds over in all other areas as well. This is a larger ideological struggle, and I think those who analyze it correctly in the realm of energy, I think we have to start to see the bigger picture. We cannot deal in these peculiar things. We have to look at the larger picture as such.
Absolutely, and you're right. It's so much bigger than just climate policy. This is ideological warfare. And I do want to ask you something more about what we're seeing in Iran, but just on these climate policies, because we are seeing real pain now of these policies, and yet those in power are pushing ahead, even as prices soar and double and triple in some cases. We've seen uprisings in places like Sri Lanka. To a much lesser extent, we saw one in the Netherlands with the farmers. Do you see that happening elsewhere?
I think it's highly possible. I think one of the things that still keeps things going is there is still this normalcy bias that most people assume the way it has been in the last decades is also the way it's going to be in future decades. So to be a little bit more facetious, in Europe, there is still this idea that, bread comes from the supermarket, electricity comes out of the wall, and money comes out of the ATM. But once we realize that everything that makes these things possible is crumbling, is getting more expensive, is getting less reliable, I think then it's only a very small step for people to actually go to the streets. So I don't give investment advice, but in Europe, in some areas, you might want to go long on pitchforks. So I think this is something that might be happening sooner than we think, because blackouts, rationing, these things are already discussed and are basically in some areas already being implemented. I think this is going to get worse.
Now, I want to ask you also about the media and their coverage on these issues, and got another example today of the media getting it wrong. The Brazilian election just concluded, and there's going to be a second round after the result was much closer than most of the media was predicting. No candidate achieved 50%. Just quickly tell my viewers about what happened there.
Yeah, right. As you said, I think the last polls before the actual Brazilian elections saw Lula ahead about 13% of Bolsonaro. So I think Lula was supposed to be around 48 and Bolsonaro was seen around 35. I think the actual results now were 48 for Lula and about 46, 47 for Bolsonaro, which once again tells you that these right-wingers, however we want to describe them, are much more popular with populations than we think. Because you have to keep one thing in mind. These candidates, whether it's Bolsonaro in Brazil, whether it's Orban in Hungary, whether it's Meloni in France, they're not just running against the opposition or other candidates. They're running against the entire media cultural complex as well. So people who are not particularly in tune with the news, they only constantly hear, oh, those are fascists, those are racists, those are the worst that the world has ever brought forth. And yet still apparently a significant number of people is willing to vote for them. And this brings me again to this larger point. There is a class divide I think we're not talking enough about, where you have an upper class that has now for decades marinated in an ideology that I think one guest you have on later today, right, Douglas Murray, very well diagnosed, which is mostly consisting of self-hatred. And I think this is something we see kind of moving through all the institutions and all the areas. And this has actual political consequences. To give you one very quick example, the US military has serious problems matching its needed recruitment numbers. So the number of people that want to join the US military is declining. But the same military is all of a sudden starting all these outreaches, diversity outreaches, and they had their own kind of, drag queen story kind of thing for its soldiers. And it turns out that is not particularly popular with people who want to have to join the military.
No, Ralph. Critical race theory is not something the military should be indulging in at all. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We'll definitely have to speak to you again. Ralph Schoellhammer, thank you so much for joining me tonight.